Hello everybody, and you are very welcome to this very special episode of Successful Perspectives. Successful Perspectives is when we deep dive into a topic that impacts all of the leaders in our very selective network, Boardroom by EMIR. Today's discussion is how we safely transition to a net zero future, and I am delighted to be joined on the beautiful boat by address for this fascinating conversation with Ali Al-Janabi. Ali is the chairman for the Shell Group of companies in the UAE in Iraq. We're joined by Norm Gilsdorf, who is president for high growth markets at Honeywell. We are also joined by our friend Joe Annis, who is president and CEO for Europe, Middle East and Africa at GE's gas power business. And last but certainly not least, Joni Paiva, who oversees all operations for Nissan in Africa, Middle East, India and Oceania. So we're covering a big chunk of the world here today. Gentlemen, you're very welcome. It's great to have you. Ali, let's jump off and kick this conversation off with you. We're talking about how we get to a net zero future. I think a good pertinent question to start off would be, how realistic is it to reconfigure the world's energy system? We know this has to happen, but let's break down some of the details of how we get there.
Right, so I mean, obviously there's a couple of things at hand. We all know that we need to transition to a net zero. And I think we saw many companies and many countries have made that commitment. So that's, I think, a very important first step. And we in Shell, of course, have said by 2050 we'll get to a net zero emissions. And it's not just about what you do within your operations, but also what you do to your customers' operations as well. The fuel that you supply and the products you supply. And you see places like the Middle East, the UAE, also taking a very important step last year by doing the same. Now, to get there is a very big task. It requires a reconfiguration of the energy system. This is a step that requires a lot of investment, a lot of collaboration, and collaboration meaning across governments, across private sector, across, call it operators, contractors, manufacturers. It requires society to also change. It requires a cultural change. So it's actually quite a very, very big task. Now, can we get there? We've done a number of scenarios in Shell. Shell is always known for its scenarios. This is our 50th year that we've been doing scenarios. And one of the scenarios is how to get to 1.5 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial times in terms of and can we get there by 2050? The answer is yes, we can. But it requires work and action probably last year to try and get there. And it can be done single-handedly. Now, if we miss that, and we miss those steps, then there is a likelihood that we miss the commitments that the world has made to the Paris Accord. And it requires a number of things. There's a leap of faith that people have to make. There is an important part, which is, will the consumer change? And how will the consumer change its attitudes, its intent? And it also requires investments there. But there's also a leap of faith in technology, because some of the technologies that we need are not there yet, and they require that advancement in technology and going down that cost curve over the next decade to get there.
Norm, Ali just very eloquently described some of the long-term view of getting there. Tell me, first of all, from Honeywell's perspective, why this matters to a company like Honeywell, and what are some of the short-term solutions that could perhaps get us a bit closer to what Ali describes, over the next few years or so?
Yes, well, Honeywell, like Shell, has set our net carbon zero. We've set for 2035. We're actually both a producer of products and goods, as a manufacturing and chemical company, but we're also a company that provides solutions to end users. We've actually, over the last 15 years, been on a program and reduced 90% of our emissions. So what we found in doing that is there is a lot of things you can do today while we wait for the technologies that Ali alluded to that need to come to actually get to those big final steps. So what we see is there are things that we can start doing today. A good example, sustainable aviation fuel. We started about 6 years ago now making sustainable. There's now 20 plants around the world that make, the green jet fuel, green diesel fuel. That's something that can be done today. Recycled plastics, that's becoming, incredibly prevalent across Europe and now moving to the Middle East, where we can take the plastics and turn them back into plastics. And then you just look at energy efficiency and just being more efficient with what we've already got by putting in better controls, using software, just measuring and monitoring what we're using. And I think most importantly, getting everyone engaged, whether it not just be the producers or the users, but all of us. We can all play a part in this, reducing our carbon footprint by behaving differently, monitoring, whether it be our home or how we use our car, or, how we use energy in general.
I think maybe just to build on that, if I may, it's a transition. And I think that's what people forget is they almost expect there's a magic switch that you can make that step immediately. And it is a transition. And maybe just to build on one thing which I forgot to mention is, because it's a transition, it means the role for hydrocarbons is going to remain here for quite some time. So, and I think people forget that. People think that's it. Everybody has to go hydrogen. Everybody has to go electric. Everybody has to go towards biofuels. And the answer is, yes, you will get there, but it requires a lot of investments, a lot of technology, and a complete reconfiguring of our energy systems.
And Joe, you oversee the power business for GE. I guess a lot of people feel that you have this a simple conclusion that you shift to a lower carbon fuel. How realistic is that, or from a power point of view?
Yeah, no, I think the discussion so far, is in line exactly with what GE is thinking about. And what you have to think about in the challenge itself is that we refer to it as the energy trilemma. You need affordable, reliable, and sustainable energy available. So as Ali mentioned, the transition, you really need to plan for that transition, and you have to have the infrastructure, the investment, the technology to all come together. The challenge we have is to exactly do that, to get to reliable, affordable, and sustainable. So as power demand continues to grow, and if you just think about this part of the world, it's growing at about 7% per year. So in order to be able to meet that demand, while you're adding in new technologies and going through this transition, you have to balance that all out. So that's where gas has a role to play. As you're bringing in renewables into your network and into your grid, you bring on fast gas power generation, which is, let's say, the cleanest of the fossil fuels in terms of amount of emissions in that transition.
Joni, Ali mentioned something earlier on interesting about the consumers as well are going to have to get on board of this, right? Everybody, this has to be all stakeholders, everybody involved in this. It's everybody's future. The car companies and the automotive industry, right? You oversee all of operations for Nissan over this huge region. Car companies historically have been seen as part of the problem. Now, Joe mentions as we shift into higher demand for electrification, which is true of your industry. How does your industry become part of the solution within all of this, and what's Nissan thinking about this?
Well, first, it all starts with a vision and a commitment, right? So you get out there, you announce your carbon neutrality by 2050, then you roll out the plan and the roadmap. There are roughly 1.3 billion passenger cars on Earth. And we put every year 80 to 90 million cars on the roads. So first thing is to work on what you do, your portfolio, right? So what if you make out of these 80, 90 million cars on the road, the vast majority of them more fuel efficient? You have huge impact. Second, you adopt new technologies, right? Hybrid technologies that start a bit more affordable than you go to fully electric technology. So you act on your portfolio, you act also on how you do things, right? So how you power your plants, how you lower your consumption in the plants. And then the third step is how you recycle, right? For instance, we were pioneer in launching Leaf in 2011, first electric vehicle, mass marketed, we reuse some batteries to power a full stadium, right? So what you do, how you do it, and how you take care the second life of what you did.
And the mass market part of that is key for the future, right? There's a lot of players that are releasing electrical vehicles, but we need a Nissan with this kind of mass market appeal that really changes consumer behavior.
Yeah, we need to have a global reach, right? And consumer behavior, it's about culture change, right? So you need to be informed, you need to know what it is. Some markets, some countries accelerate that behavior through incentives, regulations. Others have a more careful approach, because even if everybody comes at the same time, the automotive industry will not have the full capacity to supply in terms of batteries, technologies, all these demands.
Ali, Joni mentioned an interesting word there, culture, and we've discussed things from an external point of view. What about internally within organizations in terms of the culture shifting to this energy transition? Has Shell done anything interesting to get everybody's mindset focused on this goal?
I mean, obviously there's the strategy that you set, and every company has a strategy and a vision that it sets, and clearly that commitment that we made is out there to head towards a net zero. But I think in order to really to tie your intent with outcome, what we've done is we've tied that with our executive pay. And with executive pay now, we all get impacted by the emissions that we have as a company and by being able to deliver on our emissions reductions. And so I think in a number of companies will probably use different levers. The awareness, the ability to bring that cross-learning, because there's a lot of things that we used to do for so many years on the hydrocarbon industry that can be equally replicated and applicable to the renewables business. We talked about intermittency and wind and solar and so on. Wind, for example, offshore wind now has become very big in Europe. It's the same structural engineers and the same engineers that you can who were doing offshore platforms. Similar for, let's say, gas processing and how you go with energy efficiencies. Same thing with the fuel efficiencies. So the question becomes, how do you make sure that the rest of the organization also buys into that vision? How do you make sure that the rest of the organization also feel that they also have a future? Because the last thing you want is to undermine a group of people, say, well, look, we're moving in this direction, you don't fit. And so therefore what we have also seeing is that there are many, many skills, there are transferable skills between what we have done traditionally for many, many decades to where we want to head to. And I think that is the role of management to enable that, but also the role of management to make sure that we also deliver on the commitments we made.
Transferable skills, Norm. The Middle East has built up a lot of skills in terms of hydrocarbons. What's the role for it in the future when we talk about the energy transition?
Well, I think the Middle East is fairly well placed to be a key leader in the energy transition. First of all, let's start with kind of the fundamentals. The Middle East is rich in natural gas, which, as mentioned by everybody, is a great transition fuel to help move us to a lower carbon future from either a power point of view or the production of hydrogen, where you can get, blue hydrogen to feed into a network. The Middle East also rich in sunlight, so solar power. So that's going to lead to being a central place for producing green hydrogen. The Middle East also is a great opportunity to be a carbon repository, because a lot of the CO2 can go back into the ground in the Middle East and be used to again push out natural gas or just be stored there. But now you get to the skills point of view, which also is very important. The Middle East is very good at doing large projects and doing them on time, on schedule, whether it be in the hydrocarbon industry, but just in building cities and infrastructure like we see across the Middle East. That's the transferable skills you talked about. And that'll be important as we go through this transition, because there are going to be big projects that you're going to need to be able to implement them. And the transferable skills, building a refinery versus building a gas plant versus building a green or a blue hydrogen, those are all interlinked. And then last but not least, the Middle East is well positioned geographically to be sending that green or blue hydrogen or collecting that CO2 because of its geographical location.
And Joe, we're sitting in the UAE, and I would add to what Norm mentioned there. You have all the characteristics and attributes that Norm described, but you also have countries with resources and vision. So where do you see the UAE and maybe the GCC more broadly playing into that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think starting with the GCC, I think one of the opportunities, if you look across the region, there's probably close to a quarter of the power generation today that's in open cycle. So you can take that generation, convert it into combined cycle, where you're adding a steam turbine, capturing the heat coming out of the gas turbine. In essence, you can double the power with the same amount of fuel. So from a fuel efficiency standpoint, you're really improving on that usage of fuel. So that's an immediate low-hanging fruit in terms of implementing a solution. I think specifically going to the UAE, some examples that we've done, we've taken a power plant where you've already invested into the asset. The life of that should be at least 20, 25, even 30 years. So a lot of investment's been made into the infrastructure, but you can adopt newer technologies into that plant, retrofit it, make it more efficient, and reduce the emissions that plant can do. The second thing is just that the latest efficiency that we have within the industry. We've been able to achieve 64, close to 65% efficiency of a combined cycle power plant. So for the same amount of fuel, you're actually reducing the amount of emissions, and when you adopt that technology, it obviously has a big impact. And in Sharjah in the UAE, for example, we've put our latest technology where it's close to 2 gigawatts with significant reductions in the emissions. So those are a couple examples. As Norm was talking about, that as you think about this transition, the GCC in particular is well positioned for a few things. One, space is a challenge globally. So when you're trying to adopt renewables, let's say a 1 gigawatt plant will probably take up about 13 acres of space in a combined cycle configuration. However, in renewables, you need about 5,000. So it's a significant difference in terms of the space, and that's one thing that the GCC has quite a bit of space, and obviously we have the right resources here to be able to tap into. And then the incentive of using CO2 as a way to produce or capture that to enhance oil recovery, as well as producing blue hydrogen. Those are two areas that I think are good technologies that can be maximized here in the GCC.
And you oversee a very large region from here. When you discuss with policymakers some of these more kind of future forward type of projects, the level of appetite for them here relative to other regions, shall we say, how does that square up?
Look, I think they're very forward in terms of their thinking. I mean, as you've seen, all of the GCC countries have put out a target, and all of them are thinking about how to adopt policy to be able to support that. Because as you said, many governments historically have needed to sort of subsidize some of this to spark the culture change and to make the shift happen. And this part of the world, I think they're adopting that and implementing, albeit it was slow at the start over the last decade, but you can see the activity is significantly ramping up now.
And they need partners to do all of this, right? This isn't going to be something that's going to be achieved just by government or just by industry. What about in automotive, Joni? What does cross collaboration look like within the industry?
So we need to establish links in terms of new technologies first, right? To understand, to take advantage of all these new technologies that are coming. For instance, an electric engine is a technology very well known, but an electric engine that is very low consumption for cars, because the range might be limited, it's something that has never been very developed deeply. So this is key to get the industries together to learn about the different technologies, because we need to make impact to mass market, we need to get three things together. First one is the range anxiety, right? Range anxiety, how do you fix it? You need to bring new technologies. How? In batteries, right? Solid state battery. We have announced that by 2027, we will have solid state battery, cheaper, lighter, more capacity. You need charging stations, you need ecosystems, so people are reinsured. So range anxiety is something to address. Cost, so we work really hard in terms of taking cost out of the batteries, taking cost out the engines, because the competitor of an electric vehicle is not an electric vehicle. It's the normal combustion engine vehicle. And in many markets is the second most expensive part of your budget, right? It's to buy a car. So you need to buy something you can really count on, rely on, and that you're sure about the residual value, right? Because new technologies, what if in a few years the value comes down? So you need to be sure about that. And last but not least, going back to the education, we need to get people to test, drive electric vehicles, see how it works, and to lead to this ecosystem, right? That's why we have a transition, because we need to build all this ecosystem, policies, cross companies, technologies, and the customer culture change.
And you have to drive that demand, right? You have to spark that demand through the test drives. Ali, how do we do that? How do we create demand? You know, there's a chicken and egg situation.
Very much so. There's a chicken.
You mentioned at the beginning, you know, you used the phrase a leap of faith. There's a leap of faith from a certain extent from everybody. How do we do that? How do we manage that?
So let me give you some good examples and bad examples. So a bad example, but I think it was a leap of faith. When I say bad example, I don't mean it in a negative way. I think it was a leap of faith that Shell did, along with a number of other partners, is, for example, to invest in hydrogen. And so today, if you go into Germany, north to south, east to west, there's now a hydrogen network for over 100 hydrogen filling stations. But the problem there is there are no vehicles that can service that. And if you're lucky at one, you could get 20 vehicles a week, you're extremely lucky. So then there is the conversations to be had with the equipment manufacturers to say, okay, will you be putting and where will your focus be? And that's where there's also that collaboration that Joni mentioned about, which is, it has to be not just us as developers, but also where is the next thinking coming in from vehicles. But what we have seen, for example, is that you start looking at developing small ecosystems. And those ecosystems, for example, now in Germany, same place, but you say, where should we really be focusing on decarbonization? And I think maybe that's the word that we are all kind of now familiar with, is sectorial decarbonization. So rather than moving with infrastructure, you say, okay, let me work from the customer backwards. And with the customer backwards, that's a customer solution to achieving an outcome that you both agree with. So, for example, into the ports. Many ports authorities or many ports companies want to decarbonize. And we look at, for example, in a place like Hamburg in Germany. Now there's a focus on the more of the heavy vehicles, the lorries and the trucks, and there's also the bus networks. So once you start developing that, you get a little bit more of that demand. You can start injecting it with further. So it is that chicken and egg. The second one, if I may, is about the cultural change. I think in Europe, you start looking at consumers. So what we did in a couple of years ago, that's about 2 years ago, is we've introduced the ability for a customer who comes in to fill his petrol engine, and at a touch of a button at that petrol station, you can actually offset the full volume of petrol that you have in terms of the emissions. We've seen actually quite a remarkable uptake in this. We had more than 25% uptake in the first 6 months. We thought this was almost no way, it won't happen. And what that basically does is you show up, you touch a button, you pay an extra 1 to 2 euro cents per litre or pence per litre, depending if you're in the UK. That sets then an obligation onto Shell. Shell then has an obligation to offset that tank through either carbon capture and sequestration or a nature-based solution. It all has to be certified, it's all blockchain and all, so there is that assurance behind it as well. But with that uptake, you start seeing that people who are wanting to make that step, do I really go for that electric car or do I wait for technology? Solutions can be done today to try and play your part. And I think that's really one theme that I keep on pushing with some of our customers is, play your part. I'm going to be playing mine, but how are you going to be playing yours? So that there's a collaboration with end consumer, there's a collaboration with others equipment manufacturers, and some of the players in the power and the technology side. But then there is the role of government, and I think the role of government here is one that will vary from country to country. Now, back to Middle East, back to the UAE, we've seen some really bold steps being taken here. You know, going for carbon capture, for example, they said we're going to go carbon capture. We've got 800,000 tons per day. We're going to go to 5 million, and that was an announcement that was made last year. We're going to go to capture 25% of the global hydrogen market. These are bold steps, and once you put that bold step out there, then I think the question is how do you, so you need to put up a vision. Okay, net zero, that's great, but then what is your role in that net zero? And yeah, carbon capture, hydrogen, and many more. So I think this region is really going to be taking I want to say leap of faith, but that strong, bold leap forward. They have the ingredients, the resources, the space, the technology, the new, young, and upcoming youth. Let's not forget that. There's a lot that's going to be coming in that space.
Yeah, I'd like to comment to that, and back to your last question, Trevor. I think this transition that we're going through, this challenge we have, is enabled by one thing, and that's the fact the youth is very committed to this journey we're on. And they've actually been the momentum, actually, that's been pushing the rest of us. And I think that's a great starting point, is that they want it, they see it, that's critical for their future. So with that energy and that push, which will push us all hopefully, I think we need to engage that and leverage that by making sure, first of all, that we're pushing STEM all the way down into the curriculum and getting people reinterested in science and technology, because that's going to be critical to solving these problems with technology, whether it be automobiles, whether it be electricity, whether it be carbon capture, and getting the youth back into focus on STEM and becoming scientists and engineers, which, you know, was not so popular there for a while, but I think it's coming back. And again, back to this region, I think this region has been very committed to pushing STEM development into the schools, into the youth. They've been engaging all of us to be helping push it and engage it. So I think, you know, as much as we've got a challenge, we've also got some things going on our side, because that next generation is going to push us and is really committed to it, and they'll start doing things today to help us on this journey.
I'd like to build on that a little bit, I think, on both points actually. First on hydrogen. Today we're seeing projects that are already being launched, particularly in Europe, where they're announcing that they want to see the technology that you're going to be building into a new power plant to already have capability for hydrogen. So today in Europe we're seeing projects that are launching with a requirement of having a blend of 30% with a commitment to get up to 50% and then even 100% of hydrogen capability. Today in GE, our gas turbines can burn hydrogen up to 100% in some of our technology. We have over 100 gas turbines around the globe that are actually burning some level or blend of hydrogen today. So I think as we move forward, it's great to see that the investments are being made into the infrastructure, because that is one of the challenges of getting the sheer volume that's required into running a power plant or running an industrial plant at 100% hydrogen. So that's one of the things. But from a technology standpoint, we can do it today. And then I think the point on capability of youth and talent, and you know, Ali and Norm, you were both referring to it, but it is a challenge in the industry, and historically it's been a challenge for us, because the capability of those resources that are needed to support this transition is going to be tremendous. And the skills to be able to do that from, you know, in the oil and gas sector where you have geologists, you need that understanding as you're going into carbon capture and putting that back into the ground and making sure that it stays in the ground. So there are a lot of adjacencies to this that are going to play a critical role in this transition.
And it sounds like, you know, basically it's a talent issue, right? So just I'm curious about this point. It's very interesting. 10 being very optimistic, 0 being very pessimistic. On the talent piece, you know, in terms of the supply of that talent for hydrocarbons, for chemicals, for the transition more broadly, how optimistic are you that you have that level of talent coming through as an industry, not necessarily Shell?
I think not great.
Not
Five,
great.
5 at best.
5, Norm?
I'm in the five, maybe optimistic 6, but no more.
Let's say 5.7. Joe?
I'd probably be where Norm is.
See, this is an issue that it comes up,
Yeah.
but when you think about it, that's the future, whether we're going to solve this.
But I would say I have college-age children, and when I talk to them, when I talk to their friends, they are extremely passionate about this topic, and they are very, very committed to making sure that if we don't get it right, that they're going to get it right.
But we need the STEM, we need the
Exactly.
engineers,
Yeah.
we need the governments, and we need incentives to push students into this space. And it should be configured in a way that you are literally saving the planet. Go and educate yourself in an area that's going to save the planet. What a great narrative to push out. Joni, you were going to jump in?
Plus, it's a huge opportunity of new jobs that don't exist today that will exist tomorrow. So we don't have the talent, yes, and I'm like you. We need to get more, train more people, but for our kids, for our future, I mean, the jobs that are going to come in the next years are tremendous. So huge opportunity there, and that's how I see it very optimistically.
Maybe just one last question for all of us before we wrap up. You know, Joe mentioned his kids, and it's a nice way of bringing it down into what this really means for everybody and the planet. How optimistic are you, Ali, that we get close to some of these, well, we meet these expectations and commitments that have been made by governments and by companies? As we sit here today, how optimistic are you? What are the things we'd need to overcome in order to get there?
I think I am optimistic. I think there's a lot that we can replicate from places like Europe to places like the Middle East, if I want to bring it closer to home. And you talked about SAF and synthetic and biofuels, and we talked about hydrogen and hydrogen, you know, and the infrastructure that's required, and the carbon capture element, and how do you turn that into a business? I think there are models that we can actually bring and replicate, but it requires government support. So I think the real question here is, it's not as can we do it? I think the answer is we can. Yes, we can. It seems to be the motto. And can we play our part as industry? Yes, we can. But I think there's also the role of government. Government needs to be able to step in with policies. Government needs to step in with supports. I wouldn't call it subsidy, but I think there is support that's required. If I really look at the industry of, let's say the gas industry, and the gas industry is going to continue to be a transition fuel, absolutely, and I hold 100% with you there. But look at the infrastructure that was there in Europe in 1970. Just look at a map, and many of you have seen that map. 1970 versus where it is today. It took a long time to get there, but the infrastructure and the investment was done by government, but by companies who were able to have a return on that investment for that period of time. We need to be thinking in the same way in terms of what is a collaboration between industry and government. How do we make sure that you entice that investment? There will be a few loss leaders, don't get me wrong, and I think this is how we all learn, but that support from the government. And then last but not least is, how do we also make sure that the consumer's behavior starts changing? I'm optimistic with the youth, because the youth is really coming in with their new ideas and thinking, and there are today, my children, I've got 3 young girls, the eldest is 12 and the youngest is 8, and they ask me questions, and sometimes I get into an awkward place with them. So are you involved in this? It's like, no, I'm trying to capture this and put it back in the ground. Yeah, but why did we produce it? And so that education is there, but I really believe that the youth will also put pressure on us to get there. So we will get there. I'm optimistic.
A leap of faith, a joint leap of faith by government, industry, consumers. We're all going to have to do it. Norm?
I'm optimistic too. The reason I'm optimistic is, first of all, there's a lot we can do today. I mean, we've shown that with just making ourselves more efficient, more productive. We can start the sustainable aviation fuel. We're already capturing carbon. We're already making hydrogen. let's build upon that. So a lot of the technology is there today. Second, the governments have set a vision. You're right, we need more policy to go with that vision and the things that go with policy to be able to support the investment. And then we've got the youth that are going to be pushing us and interested. Now we need to make sure they're not just pushing, they're part of the solution, and they study science and technology, and they become part of the way forward. But I think all those ingredients are there, so I think we can make a big step. But it is a challenging journey, and it's going to take some time, it's going to take money, it's going to take technology, but I think we're all on board that we've got to do it.
Joe?
I'm optimistic. I think a couple things. One, as I mentioned the trilemma, it's not going to be one size fits all. So every part of the world, every country, they're going to have their own challenges, and they're going to have their own geographic constraints. They're going to have their own resource constraints. So this isn't one solution that gets implemented and spread across the globe.
But does that not make it even more complicated?
It does, but it makes it where you have to be realistic about what your expectations are on what you have available and how you're going to get to that transition. So it is a journey, and as you look at what those resources are, you look at what technology is available, the commitment's there. From a technology standpoint, it's there. From capturing to generating it to putting the infrastructure to get it, it's all there, and it is going to require that collaboration between government, industry, putting policies in place. But it also requires companies and technology to actually make those investments. We're spending a lot of money doing that, but we're also working with policymakers, governments, drafting, we've issued a white paper for the GCC specifically talking about this topic and laying out what are the challenges, what are the technologies that are available, and how do you go about that transition.
Maybe if I could just add to that, if I may, it's each of us as companies, we've already made a pledge. And so whilst waiting for governments to make their own pledges or make their own policies, we've set out certain boundary conditions by which we will evolve and move forward. So the net zero, great, and some of us, I said, gone to the next step. We talk about synthetic or sustainable aviation fuel. We've also made that commitment. 10% of the volumes that we market and sell globally by 2030 is going to be, sustainable. Same thing we've done with the carbon capture. Same thing we've done with the hydrogen. I think there's an element of to say, how do I focus also on my own needs? Maybe that I'm from here as an operator. So you look at these captive plays just to try and get that investment going. And once I firmly believe it's once you get that investment, whether it's a pipeline or hydrogen or a SAF plant, then you'll start seeing. It's a bit like this project in Iceland, the direct air capture. The queue on that is huge for people who want to just grab some of that credit, carbon credit. But it's just somebody who takes that leap of faith, takes that step forward, and I believe once the infrastructure there,
then the momentum comes. Joni, how optimistic are you? Because in a way you're also going to have to educate a whole consumer base on the benefits of this.
Pressure.
And I see this Nissan at Expo. That's part of the big partnership that you guys done. How optimistic are you that can be done?
Yeah, I think that this world has never been so technologically advanced as of today. So that's a huge advantage. Second, some parts of the world are putting tremendous pressure in accelerating the shift. Europe, many automotive companies have announced now they're going to go full electric, 100%. So we're going to learn from that experience, right? So this acceleration of the movement of electrification will benefit from the rest of other regions because we must develop, improve, accelerate from there. So that's the second point. And the third point is that from electrification point of view, once you drove an electric car, it's so fun to drive that you don't go back.
So you think the adoption curve is going to be very strong?
I think it's going to be faster than what we believe. because first the technology is going to come. We're going to have technological breakthroughs. The transition, to your point, this is transition also because it's the current business model, right? It's the current vehicles that we're selling that are financing the future also, right? So if you shift too quickly, you break the business model. So that's why naturally also we're going through a transition.
I just want to mention one thing. I think, you know, when I was talking about the challenges of not one solution everywhere, this is part of it, right? If a part of the globe decides to go with electric vehicles, right, you're naturally going to increase power demand. How do you balance that? How do you make sure that you have the right balance on your network to be able, in order to support that transition? So there are a lot of things that have to be thought through as each part of the economy or country is going through this transition. How do you support that? So those are some of the things when you're trying to balance out these decisions.
Not least resources and the talent that go with it as well, right?
Yep.
Gents, thank you so much for your time. Ali, Norm, Joe, Joni, thanks so much. It was fascinating. We look forward to having you again on one of these sessions. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for this session of Successful Perspectives, and we look forward to connecting with you on the next episode.